Our second Wednesday night looking at the book of Proverbs. Remember, we're looking at Proverbs based upon Solomon's subjects. And so this is not verse by verse, but we're looking at a topical study, going in here and trying to find various topics, various subjects that we can look at and find a lot of information about these in the book of Proverbs. So again, it's good to see everyone tonight. Now, we're going to be continuing to look at this first handout. It's just entitled Proverbs, a study of Solomon's subjects. Introduction. It begins with book. Now, if you don't have one of these tonight, you need one of these. So raise your hand if you didn't bring yours back or if you need one of these. Thanks, Glenn. Tony, you want to? Thank you. Now, in a couple of weeks, we're going to have another handout. And relative to that handout, we're not going to take the time on that handout to go through it in class. We're probably going to be looking at this series for 1 quarter, so our time is very limited. So we want to look at as many topics as we can. So this will suffice as our introduction. We do have, as we've said, another handout. We do want you to get that. And so a couple weeks we'll have it. You can get it. We might mention a couple of things from it, but we will not take the time with that one that we are taking with this one. So please get that handout. In a moment, we're going to be going back to that handout. But remember, last week I asked you to do 2 different things, okay? 2 different things. Number 1, if you want to, write down a proverb that you particularly like or one that's interesting to you or one that is unfamiliar, and give it to me, and we'll begin class by just looking at one proverb and then getting into the lesson. So if you want to do that, submit a proverb. Write one down. Just give me the proverb. We'll use it at the beginning of class. The second thing we ask you to do is to look through Proverbs, and if you want to, submit a topic. Give us something to look at in the book of Proverbs. Think, for example, we could talk about the fool. We could talk about wisdom. Thank you, Tony. We could talk about just anything that Proverbs has to talk about, the fear of the Lord. These are all things that are great topics. And so go ahead as you're reading the book of Proverbs. If you come across something, then write it down. Again, the topic of the tongue, how to use our lips, that is so frequently referred to in the book of Proverbs. So some very powerful lessons, some very practical lessons. Now also, think about this. Last week we were talking about some, familiar Psalms, and one of the most familiar, Proverbs 3 and verse 5, trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Lean not into your own understanding. We also talked about some insightful Psalms. And think about Proverbs 14 and verse 34. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. And we also talked about some humorous Proverbs. And so these were some things that after class, I'm going to mention in a moment one that Iris said. Now, Iris, if I get it wrong, that's okay. Just tell me what the right one was. And I think Betty told me one too that we were trying to figure out exactly where it was. So I'll look at one from Iris, one from Betty. If these are not the ones you had in mind, write down at least in essence what it was, and we'll use it later on. But think about one. I made a reference to one. Turn with me, if you will, to Proverbs 26. In Proverbs 26, I made a reference to this. We didn't give you the reference last week, but here's one that I find very humorous. Now, yes, it is tinged with sadness because it's talking about the lazy individual. And you go back to those topics, those subjects, slothfulness. That's one of the topics that is mentioned on numerous occasions in the book of Proverbs, contrasted by being industrious, okay? So maybe that's a topic that you want to look at. But look at this. In Proverbs 26, specifically, if you will, look with me at verse 14. At verse 14, it says, "As the door turns on its hinges, so does the lazy man on his bed." Now, just the mere imagery of that is sort of comical. You know, we all know how a door functions. A door has hinges. And so you can open that door and you can swing it left, you can swing it right, and just like that door swings on its hinges, here is the lazy man in bed, and what he does, he turns to the left, he turns to the right, and he just is sort of like that door. Doesn't want to get up because that would mean doing something, you know, but just like that door turns on its hinges, so does the lazy man in his bed. Turn back with me, if you will, to Proverbs 6. Look at this. In Proverbs, the 6th chapter, just a couple of verses here. Proverbs 6, read with me, if you will, verses 9 through 11. Just a little bit more insight to that slothful individual, that lazy person. Look what it says. "How long will you slumber, O sluggard? When will you rise from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep, so shall your poverty come on you like a prowler, and your need like an armed man." And so here is that lazy individual, that slothful man, that sluggard. And again, his whole point is, I just need a little bit more time, a little sleep, a little slumber. Now, every one of us have given the clock, you know, that little tap to get 5 or 10 more minutes. But the sluggard, if he had an alarm clock, he would just be hitting it all the time. He's not getting up. He just is always begging for a little bit more sleep, a little bit more slumber. Well, again, comical, but sad because of the reality in so many situations. Look at this one. Iris mentioned this one. And again, if I'm wrong, Iris, you correct me because we want to get it right. But turn with me to Proverbs 19. Proverbs 19, we're going to read one verse here. And what's interesting about this is it's going to be mentioned almost verbatim again in the book of Proverbs. In Proverbs 19, look with me at verse 24. And notice this is again about the lazy man. The lazy man, what does it say about him? "A lazy man buries his hand in the bowl and will not so much as bring it to his mouth again." Now that's lazy, okay? He buries his hand in the bowl. He's going to get something to eat, but again, now remember, this man is so lazy, he does not bring it to his mouth. Now, we're given no reason why, save the account that he's lazy. Look at this also in Proverbs 26. Proverbs 26, look at verse 15. It states the same thing at the beginning, but it gives us a little bit different insight at the end of this verse. Proverbs 26 and verse 15, it says, "The lazy man buries his hand in the bowl. It wearies him to bring it back to his mouth." And so here's the reason why he doesn't take it out of the bowl and feed himself. It wearies him. That's just a little bit too much to ask him to do. You know, he's done enough, I guess, in his mind to get his hand in the bowl. But to bring it all the way back up to his mouth and actually feed himself, that's wearisome. Well, again, comical, but it strikes a chord because we see this kind of slothfulness and this kind of laziness so much in our society today. One more One more. Betty gave this thought. In Proverbs 17, look if you will, Proverbs 17, look at verse 12. Look at verse 12, and this not only falls under the humorous, but also the insightful, because notice what it says. Proverbs 17 and verse 12, let a man meet a bear robbed of her cubs rather than a fool in his folly. Now, a bear robbed of her cubs. Here's a she-bear. Somebody has taken her whelps, okay? And I guess there is no better example of brute ferocity than that right there. You know, so many times when you hear about a bear mauling, it's because somebody got too close to the cubs, and mama's going to protect those cubs. And so here is a bear robbed of her cubs. And again, in that state, there is so much excitement in her head, so much anger. She's going to do something. And typically, you know, the first person that gets in her way, it doesn't even have to be the person that took the cubs. She's going to take it out on them. Well, I think that's part of what we're looking at here. Solomon is saying it's better. It's better to meet a bear robbed of her cubs than a fool in the midst of his folly. You see, a bear can be pacified with the return of the cubs. She's going to get them and she's going to get off to safety. But the problem is with a fool, you can't pacify a fool. You can't calm a fool down, because the very thing that could and should calm them down, to reason with them, to offer possibly a reproof or a rebuke, they're not going to listen to that. They're going to have nothing to do with that. And so this fool loves his folly as much as the bear loves her cubs. And so the bear can be pacified, but the fool can't. You can't reason with a fool. They have their passions, they have their desires, and if you get in the way of that fool, then you've walked into a mess. It's worse than the mother bear looking for her cubs. Think about it like this. I've heard of this on at least a couple of occasions. When a family member invites another family member to live with them, they're battling a problem, typically an addiction, and when that desire, when that need is at its fullest, the one that has that passion, that desire, they will do anything to fulfill that need. They will rob from the very one who's opened up their home. They will take from their mother, they will take from their grandmother. It does not matter. It's worse than that bear robbed of the cubs, because here's the need. I want to satisfy that need, and so I will do whatever I have to fulfill that desire. Well, interesting Proverbs, are they not? And what's so amazing about the book of Proverbs is that throughout it, these 31 chapters, there is so much information. There are so many situations brought to life by such insightful language and picturesque language. Now, let's do this. Let's get back to our handout tonight. We're going to try to finish this evening, but again, it's this one entitled Proverbs, a study of Solomon's subjects, Introduction. First page, we're looking at the book, and that's where we stopped. We stopped on this first page. Look about 3/4 of the way down, where it mentions Proverbs is quoted several times in the New Testament. Thus, it obviously has a very practical application in the lives of Christians today. Now, we're not going to take the time to look at so many of the times that a passage in Proverbs is quoted in the New Testament, but let's cite just a couple of more. Last week we talked about Proverbs, the 3rd chapter, verses 11 and 12, and you'll see that mentioned, quoted in Hebrews, the 12th chapter, beginning in verse 5, talking about the child receiving the discipline, the chastening of his Father. Well, look at a couple more of these. Look with me in Proverbs 3. Look at verse 34. Proverbs 3 in verse 24. Now, as soon as we read this, you'll remember New Testament verses that are just like this. Proverbs 3 and verse 34. Notice what it says. Surely he scorns the scornful, but gives grace to the humble. Keep your place in Proverbs. Turn to James 4. Turn to James 4. Let's read verse 6 here. And once again, this is what we're looking at. James 4 and verse 6, this quotation from Proverbs 3. Notice what it says, familiar language here. It says, but he gives more grace, therefore he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Well, that's referring to what Solomon has written. Look at another one with me for just a moment. Look at Proverbs 10 and verse 12. Proverbs 10, verse 12. Look what it says. Hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all sin. Love covers all sin. Turn with me, if you will, in 1 Peter, the 4th chapter. Let's read a verse here. 1 Peter 4, look at verse 8. 1 Peter 4 and verse 8. It says, above all things, have fervent love for one another, and then notice it quotes what we just read, for love covers a multitude of sins. Well, you'll find this again. Proverbs talks about that dog returning to the vomit. Peter will talk about that in 2 Peter, the 2nd chapter, verse 22. And so it's interesting because obviously for the life of the child of God in the New Testament, Proverbs has a lot to say, to give us counsel, to give us direction, to give us wisdom, to give us insight. Take, if you will, open up your study sheet. Notice what it says here, author. Notice this first point. The author of all 66 books of the Bible is God. And I always try to point that out. I know what commentators and I know what the commentaries are saying when they talk about the author, Solomon. But Solomon is the human scribe. God is the author of every one of the 66 books in the Bible. And I think that's noteworthy. I think we ought to always remember that. Holy men of God spake as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. That's what Peter tells us in 2 Peter, the 1st chapter. Again, all Scripture is given by inspiration of God. 2 Timothy 3 and verse 16. And so the author of this book, well, ultimately it's God. And so look at the next point, though. The human scribe behind the book of Proverbs is Solomon. We cited 3 verses there within the book of Proverbs. Solomon lived some 600 years before the golden age of Greece, when Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle flourished. The next point, the book of Proverbs seems to be a work of a few authors, Solomon being the principal one. The next point, also mentioned in the book are Agur, chapter 30 and verse 1, and King Lemuel, chapter 31 and verse 1. Now, both of these, really, King Lemuel is unidentified. Some think that King Lemuel is another reference to Solomon. But nevertheless, other authors are mentioned. Look at the next point here. Solomon also wrote 2 other books, namely Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. Of the 3 books which make up what has been referred to as wisdom literature, Solomon wrote 2. Some have suggested that he wrote Song of Solomon when he was a young man, Proverbs during his middle age, and Ecclesiastes when he was advanced in years. Now that's an interesting thought to ponder, yet we don't know that. Look at the next point here. Solomon's name means peace or peaceable. And he was also called Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord. 2 Samuel 12 and verse 25. Solomon was the son of David and Bathsheba. Write down a verse here, 2 Samuel 12 and verse 24. It gives us this reference about David and Bathsheba. Again, he was the 10th and last son of David and the second by Bathsheba. Solomon was also one of the kings of Israel, and that's noted in Proverbs 1 and verse 1. Again, he was the third and last king of the United Kingdom. Remember, Saul was the first king, and then David, and then when David passed, of course, Solomon is reigning. Remember, when Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam is going to take the reign, and this is when they come to him and they say, please lighten the load. He will not do it. And so after that, we start reading about the divided kingdom. So Solomon is the last king over the United Kingdom. Look also on that third page here. In 1 Kings 3, God told Solomon that he could ask what he wanted, and it would be granted. You remember that story? Again, ask whatever you want. God says, I'm going to give it to you. You know, I wonder at times, I'm sure in our minds, we've all put ourselves in that position. But what would it be? If God told us, as he told Solomon, you can ask anything. Ask anything, and I will give it to you. Well, of course, look at this next point. Solomon's request for an understanding heart pleased the Lord, so he granted him unparalleled measure of wisdom. In 1 Kings 3, verse 10 through 13, and verse 28, chapter 4, verses 29 through 31. Now, if we have time at the end of class, we'll come back and look at some of these, but it's incredible, the wisdom that Solomon had. And as we'll note in just a moment, the world heard about Solomon's wisdom. The world wanted to come and sit at his feet and hear his wisdom. Look at the next point here. People came from all over the world to hear the wisdom of Solomon. You remember 1 Kings 4 and verse 34, and then in chapter 10, verses 1 through 8, this is the queen of the south, or the queen of Sheba. She comes, and remember what the Bible tells us? She tested him with difficult questions, and he answered all of them. And remember her response? I had heard of you, but the half wasn't told me. You know, I heard about this wisdom, but, implied is I didn't really believe it, and not only do I believe it now, but they didn't even tell me the half of it. You know, difficult questions. I don't know about you, but, always when you're on the wrong end of a difficult question, you're longing for the wisdom of Solomon, because there was nothing that she could ask him that he didn't know about, that he couldn't divulge. Again, look at this next point. It says Solomon wrote 3,000 proverbs, 1,005 songs, as found in 1 Kings 4 and verse 32. Now, interesting, because Sunday morning we're looking at the Song of Solomon, and again, it's also referred to in Song of Solomon, the first verse, as the Song of Songs. And that's a superlative. It's really emphasizing, of all the songs that Solomon wrote, this one that we know of as the Song of Solomon is the Song of Songs. It is the greatest of all songs. It's like Revelation 19 and verse 16. Jesus is King of kings, and he's Lord of lords. Of all the kings, Jesus is King of those kings. Of all the lords, Jesus is Lord of those lords. Of all the songs, 1,005 that Solomon wrote, that song, Song of Solomon, Song of Songs, is the best song. It's the greatest song. And so he wrote 1,005 songs. He wrote 3,000 proverbs. Now, what we have in the book of Proverbs is about 900 of those proverbs. So just a little bit less than a third of Solomon's proverbs. And so look at this last one. Solomon was a musician, poet, botanist, zoologist, businessman, administrator, and king. It's interesting. You go back to 1 Kings, the 4th chapter, and it will talk about what Solomon knew about and what Solomon wrote about and about the trees and about, all of nature. So he was blessed with just an amazing amount of wisdom. Now, the dating for this book, look if you will. Solomon wrote his Proverbs around 950 to 900 BC. Hezekiah's collection, that is mentioned in chapter 25 and verse 1, the men of Hezekiah, it was formed somewhere around 700 BC. Proverbs as one book was probably brought together around or shortly after that date, namely 700 BC. Look at the title. The title comes from Proverbs 1 and verse 1, which declares, "The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel." Again, the Hebrew word for proverb, mashal, comes from a root word meaning to be like or to represent. And so that's what we're seeing in Proverbs. We're seeing things many times that are like one another or represent one another, sometimes by way of contrast, okay? Continue to read, if you will, with me. The next point on the last sheet, mashal can also be translated parable. It is a broader and more comprehensive term than either of our English words, meaning proverb or parable. The Greek word parabole, often rendered parable in the New Testament, means, quote, to place one thing before or beside another. Para, beside, and bole, to cast or place, hence to compare. And so that's what we're going to be finding a lot of times. Remember some of the ones we looked at already? Just like that door that moves on its hinges. What does Solomon compare that to? The lazy man on his bed. It's just like that sluggard is hinged, if you will, to the bed. And all he can do is move this way and move that way. He's not going to get up, okay? A little sleep, a little slumber, always wanting a little bit more. And so, but that's the very nature of this book, Proverbs. Again, look at the next one. A proverb may be, and sometimes is, expanded into a parable. It is also true that a proverb may be regarded as a condensed parable. So think about what's being said here. A proverb is a smaller idea concerning a parable. The parable would be the, short story long, if you will. We always talk about long story short. We're going to condense it. Well, if you're condensing a parable, you'd condense it into a proverb. If you're going to expand that proverb, it would be expanded into a parable. You'd put a little bit more with it and in it. Again, look at the next point here. Proverbs are insightful maxims about conduct and character. And remember, this is what Proverbs is emphasizing. It's emphasizing the right way to live, the right way to walk, the right way to follow. And so, again, that's what this is emphasizing, the conduct. And that conduct is brought about, of course, by the character. Again, look at the next point here. A proverb signifies a terse utterance in contrast with a wordy one. Now, you won't believe this, I know, but when we were looking at some of this a couple of quarters ago, Sunday morning, back over here in the rooms, Elizabeth Ferrier. She took this statement right here and used it to contrast Tyler and myself. Okay? Tyler was the terse utterance, and I was the wordy one. Now take that up with her, okay? Please, please take it up. Let her know that you've heard what she has said. And please don't believe her proverbs. They're not like Solomon's. Look what it says underneath that. It says, quote, "A proverb takes something we're familiar with and places it beside something we're not familiar with. Then similarities or dissimilarities, as the case may be, are pointed out." And so remember, you're laying it beside, and so we're looking at either similarities or we're looking at dissimilarities. It's either by way of comparison or by way of contrast. But that's so many times what a proverb is doing. Look at the next one. This quote, "A proverb is a pithy sentence, clearly and concisely expressing some fact, truth, concept, and idea, sometimes by parallelism, often by contrast, and not infrequently by comparison." So when you're reading through the book of Proverbs and you come up on some of these verses, just for your own exercise spiritually, for your own exercise mentally, just see, is this making a comparison? Is it setting forth a contrast? Are we looking at similarities or are we looking at dissimilarities? And again, I think the Proverbs that you'll read will be more meaningful when we understand exactly that Solomon's making a contrast here. Or Solomon is joining two things together. Maybe one thing that we're familiar with, but he's joining it with something that we're not as familiar with so we can understand it better. Now, look at the next bullet point there. It says the Spanish novelist Cervantes defined a proverb as, quote, "a short sentence based on long experience." Now, I like that a lot. A short sentence based on long experience. That's why the Proverbs are so rich. That's why they're so full, because it's just possibly at times one verse, a couple of phrases, yet it's based on long experience. There's a lot of wisdom that goes into that. Look, if you will, at the next one. The first appearance of the word proverb in the Bible is found in Numbers 21 and verse 27. This is where it mentions those who speak in Proverbs. It's just mentioning those who speak in Proverbs here. But that's the first appearance of the word proverb in the Bible. And this last point here, the first citation of a proverb, is found in 1 Samuel 10 and verse 12. And in that verse, that's when it's talking about it became a proverb. And what became a proverb is the statement, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" And so when we look at this first sheet, hold on to this sheet. This again is going to be added to with another sheet. It'll be introduction and it'll be conclusion. And we'll have a lot more information. But like I said, because we're trying to look at Proverbs this time by one quarter or in one quarter, we want to try to make sure that our classes, even like when we did it a couple of quarters ago in room 19, we were able to take some time with some of the topics because it was a two-quarter class. This is not going to be a two-quarter class, so we're not going to take the time. We're going to try to look at every topic one Wednesday night. And I think there's a lot of value in that too, because we'll try to pick out the very best that Proverbs has to say, and whatever it is we're looking at, we will try to complete that within one evening. Now, is there any topic from the book of Proverbs that you say, this is, if you could pick one topic for us to explore, for us to look at together, what might it be? Now, you don't have to talk if you don't want to talk, but I want to say this again, because please, even if you don't want to raise your hand, you don't want to give us it verbally, write it down. Write it down and give it to me, because we're looking, I could pick easily enough topics, enough subjects to go through this quarter. But it would be some of what I wanted to look at from Proverbs. I would rather it be what you want to look at. What you say, this is meaningful to me. Or, I haven't heard this before from Proverbs, and I'd like for us to explore this. What does Solomon say about this topic? So, write it down, or if you have it right now, raise your hand and shout it out to me. We'll write it down. We'll make sure that we incorporate it in class. Anybody? What was that? Proverbs 1. The first chapter, okay. Anything from there, Tony, or because Proverbs 1 is... Okay. Tony's going to get with me, because something in Proverbs, the first chapter, we'll be looking at. And it's so rich. Remember what we said? I wish we could just go verse by verse, chapter by chapter, but I'll guarantee you that would be a year-long class. And the only problem with those classes, now, please understand, I'm not saying there's anything wrong, but typically when you have a class that long, when you get through with it, we're thinking, what did we look at? Where did we begin? What was said? So you can spend too much time, and you can spend not enough time. I hope that in this quarter that we are able to examine thoroughly several topics, several things that Solomon says that these things are very important, because he will mention it on numerous occasions in the book. Write down the verses. Write down any verse, so that as we begin each class, we can look at something. And sometimes all we're going to do is read it, make a comment, but again, it'll be another way for us to get into this book and just to be reminded of the vast resource, the wealth of knowledge, the expansive wisdom that we see in the book of Proverbs. It covers so much territory. Now remember this, I know we're going to get caught by the bell. Remember this also, because to me this is critical for us to realize this is not just a book thrown together about this topic, this subject. This is set forth by parents. Okay, the father and mother in Proverbs is teaching their son, their children, everything they need to know. The most important things they're going to be facing in life. So that's really, it's a domestic setting. And, this old idea that, well, children do not come with a manual. Well, I know what people are saying. You don't leave the hospital and the doctor's saying, oh, by the way, here, take this. But they do come with a manual. It's God's manual. And this book is one of the greatest teaching instruction books for parents. If you want to know, what should I be talking to my child about? What should we be discussing together? Go back and read the book of Proverbs and see everything that the proverbial father and mother has to say to their son, their children. And so be looking at the topics, thinking about these subjects, be picking out individual proverbs, verses, and again, just write them down. Please give them to me, and we'll incorporate them in our studies together. Appreciate your time, appreciate you being here tonight, and we'll go ahead and give you about 10 seconds if this clock is right.